Okay, I want to welcome our students to our homiletics discussion on the book of Philemon. Of course, this is a little different. We've been talking all about Colossians over the past few weeks, but this letter is attached to Colossians, and I've covered that in the lecture on the book itself. But Tim and I want to talk a little bit about how we would approach preaching the book of Philemon. It's limited in some ways, so we may not go quite as long on this one. I don't know. We'll just see where we go. But
I think we've said that before.
that's
And
probably
we
true and gone a full
wandered,
hour.
Right. The Israelites did not expect to wander in the wilderness for 40 years.
Indeed. Indeed. As we come to the letter, one of the questions that we have to answer is what Paul's after here. What's he trying to do? And that then feeds into, I think, how we preach the book, which we'll get to in a few minutes. But as we talked in the lecture, the scholars debate this a little bit in that, Paul's upfront sort of purpose seems to be for reconciliation, right? To bring these two men together, but maybe there's underlying things that he's hinting at as well, that maybe he wants Philemon to free Onesimus. Maybe he's hoping that Philemon will allow Onesimus to come and work with him because he says he's been useful to him. That play on words with his name, as we've talked about. But Paul definitely is the arbitrator, mediator. I think Tim's going to talk a little bit about that, between the two, and trying to bring unity not only between these two men, but as again we talked about, unity in the church, because the relationship between the two certainly would play into the relationships in the larger church because people knew them all. So any thoughts about any of that, the purpose or what Paul's after here before we jump into the preaching?
Yeah, as I shared with you at the beginning, I didn't do an extensive amount of commentary work beforehand. Right. I reviewed some of the notes I've had developed over the years. I think what you're saying is the track. I think the consensus is there's some kind of attempt at getting Philemon to accept Onesimus back. Onesimus may be a runaway slave, or he may be a slave that didn't return from an errand, which I guess is the same but slightly different. Or maybe he spent so long away that there's concern that he might be a runaway.
Right.
But either way, Paul seems to be addressing this letter in order to say to Philemon, by the way, not to mention, you owe me your life.
Right.
To accept Onesimus back as a brother. He may have as the eventual goal receiving him back. Every time I think of Philemon, and this probably goes back 43 years, almost 43 years, to New Testament survey at Milligan, what was then college, now university. And I always remember Dr. Gwatney was the Old Testament professor, but taught New Testament survey, saying that this is Paul's cleverest letter. And those words, I was I was pushing 9. I was probably 19. That was probably the second half of the semester.
Yeah.
And I remember those words. And when you read it, it kind of comes through. He's direct, but in a very tactful way.
He is. Yeah, there's several places he says things without saying them, and he sort of alludes to that, right? He basically says, I could make you do this, but I won't do that. I'm just going to ask you to do it. So there's multiple places that I think we see that.
My mother did that many times, by the way. So I'm not saying, but if you loved me, then okay, Mom. And that's similar to what Paul is doing.
It is. Well, he's in certain ways he is a father, right? He calls Onesimus his son, I think. Maybe not. Yeah, he is my son.
Well, and Philemon owes him his life, which I've already referenced, which is a way of saying I'm your spiritual father.
Indeed.
As well. So
As we prepared for this, Tim said he had not actually preached on Philemon any time, but he's taught on it a few times, and I've taught on it a couple times too. I did tack a sermon onto my Colossian series, though it really wasn't in the series. It was a sort of a standalone one-off message. And my approach was to think in terms of reconciliation. So I think Paul was trying to reconcile these two men who were now brothers, who were probably not brothers when the rift began, if Onesimus was a runaway. And again, we don't know all the details, but at some point, certainly Philemon has a problem with him, and Paul is calling these two men who are now brothers to come together in Christ. And my main point, main idea, was that reconciliation frees us from being trapped in the pain of the past, which really
Oh
is
yeah.
entirely too long. One of the lectures this week is about developing a main idea, and I struggled with this as I remember, and it ended up really that is way too long. I gave some examples in that lecture, and most of them were about half that length. But the point is, they could have been trapped, if not in the pain of the past, in the problem of the past, that would have broken fellowship in that church and certainly broke the relationship. But Paul is trying to bring them to the point of reconciliation so the past doesn't haunt the future. And I think that's one way of looking at this, because most of us have dealt with some kind of problem with another person that traps us in whatever happened, and we can't get past it. And reconciliation is the idea that we find a way to move forward together. And I went over some other ideas as well that I might get Tim to comment on too. But let me let Tim share some thoughts, even though he's not got a sermon to share. He's got some approaches that we could use. So,
Yeah, actually I preached on Philemon like 35 or
oh,
40
okay.
years ago.
Sorry, I misheard.
Well, I was going to mention that it too. I went looking for it, and I have this, what do you call it? This file folder, one of those like they look, our brothers sisters may not know what I'm talking about, but they almost look like an accordion,
Sure, sure.
you know, and and it would have been handwritten. And I looked for it and couldn't find it today. Now, with trying to file through, I got a little sentimental. I did see my first ever sermon preached in the fall of 1980. And, but I could not find it. But when I preached that sermon, I think I preached it under the kind of the theme of it being a microcosm of redemption, the drama of redemption.
Okay.
Having said that, that's probably Charles Swindoll, which Charles Swindoll is a well-known American preacher. I believe he's still alive. He's in his 80s. I haven't heard of his passing. Very popular. And his style is always go through the text. He usually outlines it in a way that's really more perfunctory or just, this is how we're looking through the text.
Yeah, it's
And
not a
then,
clever, carefully worded, alliterative
well,
outline.
a lot of times it could be alliterative, but it's not moving through the text. It's just describing the text. It's not, this is an action step. What he does, he goes through the text, and then at the end he does application.
Right.
And that's what I would call actions or lessons or whatever. And his application of Philemon is every Christian was once a fugitive. Our guilt was great. Our penalty was severe. Grace allowed the right of appeal. Christ paid the debt of our sin. Colossians 2:14. We are accepted and adopted into God's family. But so his application really has almost nothing to do with that. I won't say nothing to do with the letter, but it's not the primary purpose of the letter.
Right.
Right. But he's using this story of redemption, of Onesimus being a slave and being redeemed, and Paul wanting him to come back into Philemon's family as kind of a paradigm for our own story. And so I suspect that's where I got that from. And then the other thing I did in terms of preparation was I looked up preaching today. I did not do PowerPoint slides. which that may cause some consternation and some relief, depending on the person. I was going to add, I don't have a lot personally to add to preaching Philemon itself. And I'm thinking a lot of people will say, well, who's been watching these videos? He finally got it. he finally came to the conclusion that we've had for all these weeks. But preaching today is a site you can pay for. And so they have 6 potential sermons, and 2 of them are divided up into Philemon 1 through 8, 1 through 7, 8 through 17, I think it is, and 17 through 25. So one is 1 through 7, 8 through 16, and 17 through 25. The other one, they don't give a third sermon on the last passage, but it's there. But here's themes, okay? The one that's, and this is by a guy named Steve Aurell, Aurell, and he divides it. His first message is called Calling on Family Support, and it's this whole idea of, I guess, the church as a family, and he appealed to family unity, family encouragement, family service. Right. Again, that's from his text. I don't see me using that as an outline, but his second one, trusting in God's process, but this is probably the whole concept of redemption or reconciliation. God is the only healer is his sub-theme, and his points are: hold rights loosely, consider the mutual benefit, reflect on God's purposes.
That's interesting, because I had 3 sort of approaches to Philemon in preaching, and one of them was choose love over our rights, or something close to that. And that's not something I would have really thought about till I went through the commentaries on Philemon this time. And I talked to our students about the fact that in the United States, and this is another one, I can't speak to African culture, but you found a bug.
Yeah, that's mosquito. I didn't get it, but hopefully soon.
It'll
hopefully
get you.
It won't land on my head and I'll knock myself out like I did a couple of weeks ago. Sorry.
Rights are important to us, right? I mean,
Yes.
We talk about rights a lot, and we do not want anyone infringing on our rights. But part of what Paul is saying is, yes, Philemon, you have the right to do this, that, and the other. I'm asking you not to do that, to choose love over the exercise of your rights. And I thought that was a pretty good approach to thinking through Philemon in a way that would be relevant and maybe even a little prophetic to our culture, because people don't really want to hear that. We want to hear how our rights are our rights, and don't tell me otherwise. And so I thought that was an interesting way to go. One that I wouldn't have thought of without the commentary work. So obviously he did, whoever that preacher is, but
yeah. And he was actually a staff member at a church. Interesting. A large church in California. And his third sermon is moving towards reconciliation. Blessed as you have been blessed. This is 17 through 25. Accept the person, forgive the wrong, bestow a blessing.
Right.
I'd have to read through the text to see if I see that in there, but I could use those points. And I think they're common to almost all situations requiring reconciliation.
Right.
You have to accept that person. Yeah, and you could maybe you could forego your rights, accept the person, forgive the wrong, bestow a blessing. And then the other 2 sermons that had divided into Philemon are by a fellow named Mark Deaver. He's a well-known preacher in our country. He's very conservative, very reformed. He's part of what we sometimes reference as neo-Calvinism. And his first sermon, Will You Forgive, is on forgiveness. Now his outline is kind of just a parallel about parallel text, the foundation of the gospel, the context of the church, the practice of prayer and the necessity of love, the example of an elder. That's kind of a Swindoll approach,
it is. Yeah.
where you're going through the text, but you're not really getting your application from there, at least in terms of your points. And then the same thing with the second part, which is about repentance. Paul's authority, introducing Onesimus, Philemon's freedom. He's just kind of describing what's in the text. God's purposes, Onesimus's change status. I didn't read either of those. Well, there were 5 sermons that I just reviewed briefly, so it's hard for me to say how he may very well be doing his application in the context of those points.
Right.
But my primary point in examining those and mentioning them is just how they've divided Philemon up into portions and are preaching 2 or 3 sermons.
Right.
I assumed that one that only had 2, there was a 3rd sermon in that series, finishing out Philemon. It just was not on preaching today.
Well, and it seems to me that that's about as far as you could stretch Philemon. 3 would be the most that I could imagine doing.
I can't imagine.
I don't know that I'd do more than 1 anyway, but obviously it could be done.
I could maybe do 3, but I mean, gosh, I got like 27 from Colossians, so I wasn't that many. But yeah, it would be, I can't really imagine doing more than 3. The last sermon that was on preaching today handled Philemon as 1 sermon, and it was actually in combination with a passage from 2 Corinthians. And I just read the introduction to it. It was part of a series on, I believe it was on friendships, but either way, it was dealing with relationships. And the title was Testing the Limits, which didn't make a whole lot of sense, but the subtitle made more sense, which is Spiritual Friends Challenge Us to Move Past Our Selfishness and Impatience in order to live out the power of the gospel. Right. So based on that, he's taking Paul as the challenger, and he is challenging Philemon to forgo his rights. And that, how do we, again, I think those 3 points we mentioned a minute ago, or if you wanted to do a sermon, you could talk about forego our rights and accept the person, go beyond what's expected of you. That's similar to forego your rights, but it could be worded that way. So, and you and I talked briefly before the video started about, you could use this as a sermon on mediating between friends.
You could, and that's a different way of approaching
conflict.
Right. But I think that's there, right? There are things to learn about that. This to me is a little bit of a challenging letter because it is so personal and deals with such a very specific issue between a group of people, which sets it apart in some ways from most of New Testament letters, right? I mean, certainly some of the pastoral letters, Paul's writing specifically to Timothy, and there is some context there that we may or may not have, but this deals with such a specific issue in itself, not just specific people, but a specific problem. I think it makes it a little harder to find application for the whole church. But that's not to say it can't be done. I just think it's a little more challenging, at least for me, as I try to read through this and think about what to do with it.
I think if I'd spent more time in the commentaries in preparation, it's kind of what you said about, when I read the commentary, there's that aspect of foregoing one's rights that I wouldn't have thought of.
Right.
So I think it's one of those, if you dig a little deeper into it,
it's worthwhile.
It's worthwhile. Why does this letter show up in our canon?
I mean, it's a valid question.
That to me it's a fascinating question. Of course, we have a bishop,
right,
named Onesimus. End of first century.
Well, 110 is the reference. We talked about it in the lecture. That's the only reason I wouldn't have known that offhand.
Right. I don't know if I got it or not. I don't see
I
blood.
don't see it, so
It,
we're all
it,
good.
it probably got me first. So, I just need to sit at my computer looking at myself all day. Maybe I'd get bit by mosquitoes less. But why? And you've already covered this, I guess. So, but
Well, we
why
didn't
is
cover
this?
its canonicity. I mean, we didn't talk about why does it show up.
Why is this letter in the canon?
It's
And one of the speculations is because Philemon accepts Onesimus, and this is the Onesimus who becomes the bishop
right.
in the church. But Onesimus was a common name, especially for slaves, meant
Right.
useful.
I mean, in one, I can't remember, both McKnight and Wright, I think, reference it, but I can't remember who it was. Oh boy, who has the sort of the proposition, the theory that Philemon's actually a leader in the church in Laodicea, and this is the letter to the Laodiceans that Paul refers to in Colossians, and that's one of the reasons that it shows up. Well, I mean, that's the other New Testament scholars I read don't put a whole lot of stock in that. I mean, it's a theory, it's possible, it's workable. There's just no evidence for it.
Yeah.
That's the problem.
Oh, and I think that's a point that I thought of earlier, that this is a passage, a letter you can speculate too much on in trying to develop a sermon.
Yeah, right.
And sometimes that's great preaching. I mean, some of the greatest preachers of all time were very speculative.
Craddock comes to mind,
Whom?
Craddock comes to mind
Sure.
about doing things like that.
But it's for the mundane among us, that you want to be a little careful about stretching what we know.
Right.
I think.
Right.
And this is, we talked, and of course we've had some discussions via WhatsApp about slavery in the first century versus slavery today. Of course, how we think of it in America is probably very different than what our African brothers and sisters think of.
And quite frankly, different from what was going on in the first century, because slavery was different. And again, as McKnight says, regardless of what kind of slavery it is, we don't want to excuse it by any means.
No.
But to understand it culturally, it was very different in the first century. I'm not saying it was better somehow, but the point is they thought of it in different terms than we do because the culture was different. But it's still, for us, I think for both of us, we're still a little apprehensive about talking about slavery and speaking to it, especially in the context we are right now.
I just think, what's run through my mind is, here's 4 or 5 themes, and I think we've mentioned them, but put them together. So you have the theme, possibly, of reconciliation between people.
Right.
And in one of those sermons I mentioned, he does a job of painting as his introduction. What if your co-worker or your underling took all your money, and how would you respond to that? Or your daughter, maybe betrayed your trust in some ways, or whatever. So you could paint a picture of people needing to be reconciled. There's this theme of community.
There is. And we haven't talked about that yet.
What is community?
That's one we talked about in the lecture. So
this is Paul saying he's coming back to you no longer as a slave, verse 16, but better than a slave, as a brother. And this connects again to the Galatians 3, and to what we read in Colossians 3. No slave, no free, no male, no female. Right.
And the fact
one
that
in Christ.
The address of the letter, right, is to Philemon, and we call it Philemon, but it's not just Philemon. You've got other individuals, and you've got the church that meets in your home. This was a matter for the community at some
Right.
level. Paul addresses this to the whole church. And so here you've probably got Tychicus and Philemon standing there reading this letter out to the whole church that meets in Philemon's home.
Hmm.
So at some level, the church may be an arbiter between Philemon and Onesimus at this point.
Yeah.
So community, I think, is a valid way of looking at the letter. Anyway, you had a couple
Yeah.
more.
And do we talk about Matthew 18 there in
Oh,
church discipline,
yeah, right.
right?
Yeah,
Or if your brother has wronged you, do
right,
this, do this, do this. So community, and forgiveness, reconciliation. We've already mentioned the whole idea of mediation.
right,
Um, and I think there's some themes. Paul addresses himself as a prisoner.
right,
What does it mean to serve the church? Right.
right.
So we forego our rights. I keep coming back to that. I really like that
Well, I
language.
do too. I do too.
We forego our rights. We seek to better the community. Um,
Well,
and
I think all that goes to show that, I mean, you might look at this in terms of a series, but if you're looking at it in terms of a one sermon,
one off, yeah.
one off, there are multiple ways to come at Philemon, even in these few verses. So,
Yeah.
you might preach, if you're preaching for multiple decades in your career, you might preach Philemon in terms of community one time, and you might preach it in terms of reconciliation at another time, and rights later on. I mean, and that's sort of what we talk about in our lecture on developing a main idea, is that you're not saying it's the only idea. You're saying it's an idea that's biblically based, that speaks into the community, which is going to hear the message.
Yeah.
So it's not, you have to choose from what's going on, not necessarily choose the one thing that's here. So, and I think,
We've talked about the lectionary. It would be interesting to know if Philemon shows up in the lectionary
oh, that's a good question.
and how. There's actually somewhere I saw there's a reverse
Look up.
lectionary.
Yeah.
Did you send that to me?
I don't know. I don't remember. I mean, you'd think it was out there just because.
It basically tells you where a particular passage
Right,
is in the lectionary. It may be on my little web page,
right.
but give me just 1 second.
Yeah,
See
you
if
might be able to just search it.
that's what I'm doing.
Yeah. And
Not, I
it
want to
could be
stretch it
attached.
out, but
It could be attached to Colossians, wherever Colossians shows up in or the bulk of it shows up in the lectionary.
Philemon 1 through 21 is a lectionary passage for Pentecost 13C, which and
ordinary
this,
time. Yeah.
yeah, this is 16th Sunday after Pentecost. So actually, it should have just come up. Did we say C?
Yep.
So it should have just come up. Yeah. In fact, it did. It was September 4th,
Oh, there you
2022.
go.
Interesting on this webpage. So, let me find you again. Sorry.
Yeah.
So they're not developing it to a particular
Right. Not to a holiday.
Sunday.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Not like it shows up in
Advent or something.
Lent.
Right. Yeah.
It sounds like a Lenten passage.
It could be, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I
All
think
right.
we've exhausted it and then some, right? So we'll pick up. Tim and I have a couple more discussions coming up, and we'll share a little bit more about later on about delivering sermons and maybe some of your questions. But thanks for your attention today.